Welcome to Cash Talk Podcast.
If you're driving right now, good, because this episode is going to make you rethink 3 things you probably thought you had figured out: saving money, being rational, and planning for the future.
Housel is about to tell you that being rational with money is actually a trap, that you should save without knowing what you're saving for, and that the financial plan you made 5 years ago might be quietly working against you right now.
This is Cash Talk Podcast. I'm Ollie.
I'm Sara. Episode 4 of our series on the psychology of money. Quick recap. Episode 1, why behavior matters more than intelligence. Episode 2, the trap of never enough, compounding, and getting versus staying wealthy. Episode 3, tail events, the value of time control, the man in the car paradox, and why real wealth is invisible. Today, chapters 10 through 14, the rules. Let's go.
4 terms today, all of them matter.
First, savings rate. Not how much you earn, not how well your investments perform, the percentage of your income that you keep. Housel argues this is the variable most within your control and the one most people ignore in favor of chasing returns.
Second, reasonable versus rational. Rational means mathematically optimal. Reasonable means actually workable for a human being with emotions, relationships, and a life that doesn't behave like a spreadsheet. These 2 things are often not the same, and Housel argues that reasonable beats rational over the long run.
Third, room for error, also called margin of safety. It's the gap between what you think will happen and what you can survive if you're wrong. Not a safety net for pessimists, a strategic buffer that lets you stay in the game long enough for the odds to work in your favor.
And fourth, the end of history illusion, a well-documented psychological phenomenon. The tendency to clearly see how much you've changed in the past while genuinely believing you will not change much in the future, which means the person who made your long-term financial plan is probably not the same person who has to live with it.
Okay, chapter 10.
So chapter 10 sounds deceptively simple. Housel literally says, "Let me convince you to save money." And then he says it won't take long.
Which is either humble or ominous.
Both, honestly, because the argument he makes is genuinely different from the standard advice. He's not saying save for retirement, save for a house, save for your kids' education. He's saying save, full stop. No goal required.
And the reason is this: building wealth has very little to do with your investment returns and a lot to do with your savings rate. He uses an analogy about the 1970s oil crisis. At the time, the world looked like it was running out of oil. The math seemed clear. More economic growth, same amount of oil, disaster incoming.
But we didn't run out. And the reason isn't because we found dramatically more oil. The reason is efficiency. We built cars, factories, and homes that needed less energy to do the same things.
The US uses 60% less energy per dollar of GDP today than it did in 1950. The average car in 2019 gets the same miles per gallon as the massive SUVs that didn't even exist in 1975.
And Housel's point is, the same logic applies to money. Investment returns are largely out of your control. Markets do what they do. But your savings rate, your efficiency with money, is almost entirely in your control. And it has a 100% chance of working, unlike returns, which are always uncertain.
He makes a comparison that I found genuinely uncomfortable. He says there are professional investors grinding 80-hour weeks trying to add 1/10 of a percentage point to their annual returns. And meanwhile, their lifestyle spending has bloated by 2 or 3 full percentage points that they don't even notice.
1/10 of a point from 80 hours of work versus 2 or 3 full points sitting right there, untouched in their spending habits.
And most people put all their effort into the first thing and none into the second.
And then Housel says something that sounds almost like a provocation. He says, past a certain level of income, what you need is just what sits below your ego. The biggest driver of lifestyle inflation is not need, it's the desire to signal status to other people. Which takes us back to the man in the car paradox from episode 3. Most of what we spend beyond the basics is money spent showing other people we have money.
So one of the most powerful ways to increase your savings isn't to earn more, it's to care less about what other people think.
Pust, which is easier said than done. But it's also clarifying because it reframes saving as confidence, not deprivation. People with genuinely strong financial foundations tend to not give much thought to what others think about their possessions.
And then Housel makes the point I think is actually the most important in this chapter. He says you don't need a reason to save. And this sounds wild at first, because our instinct is to save for something, a down payment, a new car, retirement, but that's only rational in a predictable world, and our world is not predictable.
Saving without a goal is a hedge against surprise. It's preparation for the things you can't foresee, because those tend to be the things that matter most. A medical emergency, a job loss that turns into an opportunity, a chance to start something you couldn't have planned for. The money you didn't earmark for anything specific is the money that gives you options when the world does something unexpected.
He has a line I think about often. Every bit of savings is like taking a point in the future that would have been owned by someone else and giving it back to yourself.
And in a world that's increasingly globalized and competitive, where you're no longer competing with the 500 people in your city, but with millions of people online, flexibility might be the most valuable advantage you can have. Not intelligence, not a specific skill set, the ability to adapt, wait, and move when the moment is right.
Savings buys you that flexibility, and that flexibility, as Housel says, has an almost incalculable return. Chapter 11, and this one starts with a story about a doctor who cured syphilis with malaria, which is a sentence I didn't expect to say on a finance podcast.
And yet, here we are.
So in the early 1900s, a psychiatrist named Julius Wagner Jauregg noticed something. Syphilis patients who happened to develop high fevers from another illness tended to recover. He figured the fever was fighting the infection, so he started intentionally injecting patients with a weakened strain of malaria to trigger fevers strong enough to kill the syphilis.
Some patients died from the treatment, but his success rate was roughly double the rate of patients who were left untreated. He won the Nobel Prize in 1927.
And here's the point. Fevers, scientifically, do play a role in fighting infection. A 1-degree rise in body temperature has been shown to slow the replication of certain viruses by a factor of 200. The science actually supports letting fevers run their course, at least in mild cases.
But when you're shivering under 3 blankets at 2 a.m. with a 103 temperature, you are not interested in the science. You want Tylenol, right now.
It may be rational to let the fever do its job, but it is not reasonable. And that distinction is what Housel is building to.
Academic finance is full of mathematical optimal strategies, but what most people actually need, what they'll actually stick with through market crashes and life disruptions, is a strategy that lets them sleep at night, not the optimal one, the livable one.
He gives this stunning example. Harry Markowitz. This man literally won the Nobel Prize in economics for developing the mathematical model for balancing risk and return in a portfolio, the foundational theory of modern investing. And when he was asked in an interview how he personally invested his own money back in the 1950s when he first developed the model,
he said he split it 50-50 between stocks and bonds. Not because the math said that was optimal, because he didn't want to regret being out of the market if it went up or being fully in if it crashed. He was minimizing future regret, which is a human goal, not a mathematical one.
And Housel's point is that's fine. That's actually smart, because a strategy you'll stick with for 30 years is infinitely more valuable than a theoretically superior strategy you'll abandon the first time things get uncomfortable.
He cites the data directly. The historical odds of making money in U.S. markets are 50-50 over one-day periods, 68% over a year, 88% over 10 years, and 100% over every 20-year period so far. Anything that keeps you in the game long enough gives you a quantifiable edge.
So the question isn't, what's the optimal portfolio? The question is, what's the portfolio I'll actually hold through the next crash?
He gives a few other examples of reasonable over rational thinking that I love. 1. Home country bias. Most investors overweight their home country's stocks relative to what global diversification would suggest. Not rational, but investing in companies you know something about, companies whose products you use, whose industries you understand, makes it easier to hold those investments when things get rough. If it reduces the chance you'll panic and sell, it pays off.
Another one, owning a small percentage of individual stocks, even if you mostly believe in index funds. Investor Josh Brown, who is a strong advocate for diversified index investing, admits to owning a handful of individual stocks, not because he thinks he'll outperform, because he's loved stocks since he was 20, and it scratches an itch that, if left unscratched, might cause him to do something more disruptive to his main portfolio.
You can have a small play money bucket that keeps your hands off the important stuff. That's reasonable. The pure rationalist would say eliminate it, but the pure rationalist often doesn't account for the fact that human beings without any release valve tend to blow the whole thing up eventually.
And then the one that surprised me most, Jack Bogle, the founder of Vanguard, the man who spent his entire career crusading for low-cost, passive index investing, saying that high-fee active management violates, in his own words, the humble rules of arithmetic.
And his son ran an active high-fee mutual fund, and Bogle invested some of his own money in his son's fund.
Not rational. And when asked about it, Bogle just said, "We do some things for family reasons. Life isn't always consistent. And you know what? That's reasonable and human and probably correct."
Chapter 12, and Housel opens with a quote from Stanford professor Scott Sagan that I want you to actually sit with. Things that have never happened before happen all the time.
The irony he's pointing at is that we use history as a guide to the future, in investing especially, but history is mostly the story of surprising events, so using it as a precise map of what will happen next is almost inherently flawed.
He calls it the historians as prophets fallacy, and it shows up everywhere in financial media. Analysts pointing to what happened in the last recession to explain what will happen in the next one. Investors comparing current market valuations to the 1920s or the 1970s.
The problem is that the economy is not a hard science. Geologists can study 1 billion years of rock data and build accurate models. Doctors can study kidneys from 1020 and they work the same in 2020. But investors have feelings, quite a few of them.
And Richard Feynman, the physicist, put it best when he said, "Imagine how much harder physics would be if electrons had feelings. Electrons don't have feelings. Investors do. And that's what makes markets so hard to predict from historical data alone."
Housel gives a thought experiment. Imagine 15 billion people born in the 19th and 20th centuries. Now imagine if just 7 of them, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Thomas Edison, Bill Gates, Martin Luther King, and Gavrilo Princip, the man whose assassination of Franz Ferdinand triggered World War I, had never existed. How different would the entire world be?
0.000000004% of people were responsible for perhaps the majority of the world's direction over the last century.
Tail events again. The same concept from Chapter 6, but now applied to history, not just investing. A tiny number of unprecedented events shape almost everything, and by definition, they cannot be predicted from what came before.
He traces 9/11 forward. The Federal Reserve cut rates, drove the housing bubble, led to the financial crisis, led to mass unemployment, led tens of millions to seek college degrees, led to $1.6 trillion in student loan debt with a 10% default rate. Nobody predicted in September 2001 that 19 hijackers would be connected to a student loan crisis 20 years later.
And the practical implication is this. The most important financial events of your future will be things history gives you almost no guide about, not because the future is unknowable in general, but because the events that move the needle most are, by definition, unprecedented.
Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel laureate psychologist, was once asked how investors should respond to forecasts that turn out to be wrong. And his answer was, the correct lesson from being surprised is not, "I'll never make that mistake again." The correct lesson is, the world is difficult to anticipate. Not a specific mistake to avoid, a fundamental humility about prediction itself.
And Housel is careful not to say, therefore, don't plan. He's saying, plan with humility. Keep your plans flexible. Don't bet your entire financial life on specific predicted outcomes. Use room for error, which is the next chapter.
Chapter 13. And Housel opens in a casino, which is also not a sentence you expect in a serious book about personal finance.
But it works. He talks about blackjack card counters, the only players in a casino who actually have a consistent edge over the house, and their strategy is built entirely on something counterintuitive: humility.
A card counter doesn't know what card will come next. They've calculated that the odds favor them in this particular situation, but they know they could be wrong on any given hand. So they bet more when the odds are good and less when they're not. But they never bet so much that a bad run wipes them out before the odds have time to work in their favor.
There is never a moment when you're so right that you should bet every chip in front of you. The world is never that consistently kind.
And this is what room for error means in practice. You build into your financial life a buffer, not because you're pessimistic, but because you understand you're playing a game of odds, not certainties.
Housel gives a personal example. When estimating what future investment returns will look like for his own retirement planning, he assumes returns will be 1/3 lower than the historical average, not because he thinks they will be, but if they are, he's still okay, and if they're not, he's pleasantly surprised.
Bill Gates kept enough cash in Microsoft's early days to pay a full year's of payroll, even if the company received zero revenue. Warren Buffett publicly pledged to always keep more than ample cash at Berkshire, saying he would never trade even one night's sleep for the chance at extra profits.
These are not timid men. These are some of the most aggressive, high-performing investors and entrepreneurs in history, and they all built in significant buffers.
And then Housel gets into something that almost nobody talks about, the emotional dimension of room for error. He says, can you survive a 30% market decline on paper? Probably yes, if you do the math. But what about emotionally? What happens to your confidence at exactly the moment when opportunity is highest? What does it do to your relationship, your sleep, your ability to keep going?
He says having a gap between what you can technically endure versus what's emotionally possible is an overlooked version of room for error. A spreadsheet says you can handle it. Your actual life may tell a different story.
And the German tanks, I love this story.
Yes, during the Battle of Stalingrad, a German tank unit was held in reserve. When they were finally called to the front lines, engineers discovered that out of 104 tanks, fewer than 20 were operational. The cause? Field mice had nested inside the vehicles and eaten through the electrical insulation.
The Germans had the most sophisticated military equipment in the world, defeated by mice.
Nobody designed their tanks with mouse protection because nobody imagined that was a relevant scenario. And Housel's point is, the things most likely to hurt you financially are the ones too unlikely or too strange to appear in your planning. The only real protection against them is having room for error that's broad enough to absorb things you couldn't specifically predict.
Save for things you can't imagine, because those are often the things that matter most.
Chapter 14, and this one is about something psychologists call the end of history illusion. And once you understand it, you will see it everywhere.
Here's the core idea. Harvard psychologist Daniel Gilbert ran research with people from ages 18 to 68. He found that people consistently and clearly recognized how much they had changed over the past 10 years, and they consistently underestimated how much they would change over the next 10 years.
Every person at every age secretly believed, I have now become the person I will be for the rest of my life, that my history has just reached its endpoint, that future me is pretty much current me.
And it's almost never true. Gilbert's quote is devastating. He said young people pay good money to get tattoos removed that teenagers paid good money to get. Middle-aged people rush to divorce people that young adults rush to marry. Older adults work hard to lose what middle-aged adults worked hard to gain.
The person making the decision is not the person who has to live with it.
And the financial implications of this are enormous. Housel tells a story about a friend who dreamed of being a doctor from the time he was a teenager. The odds were stacked against him. He came from nothing, no privilege, no obvious path, but he pushed for a decade and eventually made it. And when Housel caught up with him years later and asked how it felt, his friend said, "Awful career, man.
just awful. The stress and the hours had ground him into the ground. He was as disappointed with where he was as he once had been driven towards getting there.
Because the person who set that goal at 18 had no real ability to imagine what daily life in that career would feel like at 40.
And this creates a specific financial trap. Long-term financial plans assume that the person making them knows what they'll want in 20 or 30 years. But only 27% of college graduates end up in a job related to their major. People who planned their entire financial life around one career path at 22 often find themselves at 40 living with the financial consequences of a decision made by someone they no longer are.
So what do you do with that? Housel gives 2 principles.
First, avoid the extreme ends of financial planning. Don't plan for a life of extreme austerity just because you think you'll always be happy with very little. Don't plan for a life of maximum earning at any cost because you think you'll always love the hustle, because both of those assumptions are likely wrong. And the further out on the extreme you go, the more painful it is to reverse.
He says the people with the most endurance, the ones who actually stay on a financial plan long enough for compounding to do its work, tend to be the ones who stayed in the middle. Moderate savings, moderate work hours, moderate commute, moderate time with family. Not maxing any one thing to the exclusion of others.
Because balance survives, extremes tend to break.
Second, don't treat changed goals as failures. He talks about Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist, Nobel laureate, and how Jason Zweig described working with him.
Kahneman and Zweig could spend weeks on a chapter, working it through meticulously. And then Kahneman would send a completely rewritten version that bore almost no resemblance to what they'd done, totally transformed. When Zweig asked how he could just throw out all that prior work, Kahneman said, "I have no sunk costs."
No sunk costs. The chapter you spent 3 weeks on that no longer works? Gone. The financial plan you made at 28 that doesn't fit your life at 42? Revise it. The career path you chose at 22 that's making you miserable at 38? Change it.
Sunk costs, anchoring current decisions to past efforts that can't be recovered, are one of the most destructive forces in personal finance and in careers, because they make your future self a prisoner to decisions made by a past self who no longer exists.
Housel says, embrace the reality of changing your mind. The quicker you can let go of a plan that no longer fits, the sooner you can start compounding from wherever you actually are.
Question for this episode, and it's the most personal one we've asked yet.
Think about a major financial goal you set, a career path, a savings target, a lifestyle you planned for more than 5 years ago. How much of that goal was set by the person you are today? And how much of it was set by someone who shared your name but had different priorities, different relationships, different ideas about what a good life looks like?
And now, is that old plan still serving you? Or are sunk costs keeping you loyal to a version of yourself that no longer exists?
You don't have to answer out loud, but it's worth sitting with.
You will change, your goals will change, and the best financial plan accounts for that by staying flexible and staying away from extremes.
1 episode left.
Episode 5, and this one pulls everything together. Housel gets into how to actually think about all of this, about how much is enough, about how to structure your financial life given everything we've covered, about the actual philosophy underneath all the rules.
He also gets personal. He shares his own financial decisions, not as prescriptions, but as examples of someone trying to apply these ideas to a real, imperfect life.
And there's a chapter on confessing that nobody should fully follow anyone else's financial advice, which is either honest or deeply ironic given that we've been covering this book for 4 episodes.
Maybe both. Episode 5, final one. See you there.
This is Cash Talk Podcast. I'm Allie.
I'm Sara. Learn the money, use the English. See you next time.